Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, She Sews Happiness. I'm Mary Ellen, if you haven't been here before, and this is where I share with you my love of sewing and all things sewing related. And in today's video, the theme is books, more specifically novels about sewing, seamstresses, fashion history, you name it. I can't resist a book that has at the heart of the story sewing. So I'm going to share a few of my favourite sewing novels that I've read over the last year, and hopefully you might enjoy them as well. So the first book I want to recommend to you today is by Natasha Lester, and it's called The Paris Seamstress. And it's no secret to anyone who knows me that I get completely carried away by historical fiction, and I have to say I don't usually fall down the rabbit hole of World War II as a context. I do prefer much earlier history, such as the Renaissance period, which is what my PhD was in, by the way, in case anyone was ever wondering what it was I did before I came to sewing and to my current career, which is in librarianship. So I'm still with books, just in a very different capacity. But yeah, when the genre of historical fiction aligns itself with sewing, I can't really resist. And Natasha Lester's The Paris Seamstress is one of the books that has stayed with me since I read it during lockdown, actually. So almost 2 years ago now, I have to admit. So yeah, that's quite a while ago. And I remember it was one of those ones I brought home from work just because I knew that I was just getting into the bug, I suppose, of sewing, and I had started to make tiny little projects. I hadn't got into dressmaking yet or anything, but I had been gifted a sewing machine and I was getting used to it and actually starting to feel that buzz that you get when you learn how to sew. So I did pick up a few books that were sewing related, and The Paris Seamstress was one of them. It's a novel which spans generations. It's set between two different time frames. So it begins in France in 1940. Where we meet a young seamstress called Estella Bisset. Estella has a dream of becoming a famous fashion designer in Paris, but the Germans are starting to advance upon the city at the outbreak of war, and Estella's mother pretty much just sends her off to America on the SS Washington. She takes with her a small suitcase and her most prized possession, her sewing machine. She arrives in New York and she tries to make a name for herself in the garment district, which of course was the hub of fashion in America. And while she knows it's not Paris, it's all she's got. So she realizes she has to make a go of it there. And as she starts to build a glamorous new life for herself, Estella is haunted by the things that she has left behind in Paris, including a handsome stranger she met there just before she left. And you have that story weaving with 2015 with her granddaughter, Fabienne Bisset, who is actually a curator, and she has travelled from Australia to New York to attend a Met Gala, which is being held in honour of her grandmother and her iconic, at this point, fashion. So when she gets there, she is kind of on a mission. Before her father died, he related to her that there were secrets in his grandmother's, or her grandmother's, past. And so when Fabienne arrives in New York, she's really interested in finding out more about the early years of her grandmother. And when her grandmother will not share any of that information with her, she kind of starts to investigate on her own. And she does start to uncover buried secrets, and I have to warn you, they are actually quite violent and traumatic, and at certain parts of this novel it's very hard to read. And while she's finding out things about her grandmother's life, she's trying at the same time to make decisions about where her own life is going, and of course meets her own handsome strangers along the way. I think that Natasha Lester does an amazing job in this novel in bringing history to life, and most notably bringing fashion and sewing to life. There is a lot of cultural history in this novel, so it has been pretty well researched. And the way in which Lester describes Stella's feelings through motifs of sewing and fabric is really, really interesting. And I just think it's quite beautiful. And as a sewist, you find it ultimately relatable. And yeah, I think in spite of the darker aspects of this novel, what the Paris Seamstress does really is give us a life-affirming story. It's really a novel that is about chasing your dreams and fulfilling your potential. And I recommend it to anyone who has an interest in fashion history or sewing. I think you'll get a lot out of reading this novel. So the next novel I would recommend is The Dressmaker by Rosalie Ham. Now, it was published over 20 years ago now, though it doesn't feel like it. And even though it was a book that has been around for a while, I actually only read it this year. It was one of those really strange occurrences where I'd watched the film before I read the book, which, to be honest, never happens to me. If I know that there is a film coming out based on a book that sounds of interest, I'll go and get that book before I even go to the cinema to see it. But in this case, I did discover the film before I discovered the book. And maybe that was because I wasn't all that interested in dressmaking and sewing and things like that when the book came out. It maybe just did not garner my attention. But now that it has, I would say if you've seen the film like me and you maybe haven't read the book, do be aware that you might think you know the story, you don't. The book is distinctly different from the film. And for a start, I think one of the most obvious differences is that the novel is much, much darker than the film. It doesn't have the comic moments of relief that's built into the film to alleviate, I think, the darkness of the story. When you read the novel, you can't really get away from it. So The Dressmaker, I suppose, is part historical fiction, part gothic fiction, and also slightly autobiographical as well, because Ham was inspired by her mother's life. Her mother was a dressmaker in a small country town. And I think one of the things about this novel that I loved as well is that it is quintessentially Australian, and there's not an awful lot of Australian literature that really makes it mainstream in the UK, you know. But it's set in a little town called Duncatar, and if you've ever lived in a small country village or town, I have, you'll find that many of the aspects of this novel are almost disturbingly familiar. There are some cute elements like the romance. You kind of expect that in any novel, but don't think you're getting a happy ending with this because, spoiler alert, you're not. The author focuses on the darker aspects of small country life. You'll find the suspicion and the judgment that's born out of gossip and petty jealousy and ignorance, basically. And our protagonist becomes the victim to this small-minded community. So our protagonist is called Tilly. She has returned home from Paris, where she trained as a dressmaker to take care of her mother, who is a little eccentric, to say the least. Now, the locals in the town shun her, blaming her for the death of a boy who was bullying her when they were children. And Tilly has zero memory of any of this. She has no recollection of what happened. She only remembers the town mayor sending her off to boarding school and separating her from her mother at an early age. She knows nothing about the darkness of this town. She is so unaware of the connections and the lies that are being used for self-preservation by every single lead character in this story. And she basically has become a scapegoat for the failings and the sins of this community. There's a lot I could say about this book. It's amazing. But I don't want to give any spoilers at the same time. So really, all I need to tell you is that you have to read it for a start. But also that what it is actually about is the judgmental disposition of a town and how it leads to that town's downfall. It's really satisfying, actually, I have to admit, that when you see one woman getting revenge for the crimes that were committed against her when she was a child. And I suppose there's a basic premise at the heart of the book, and that is to basically treat other people with kindness, to think before you judge other people, and just be a all-around decent human being, because your words have more power than you will ever know. So, really good one. Read it. So the third book I'm going to recommend is by Carrie Thomas. It's called Threadneedle, and I'm not going to lie, I judged the book by its incredibly beautiful cover. I think when sewing is one of your favourite pastimes, it's really hard to resist a cover which features a needle and thread. It's not really to say the book is about sewing, because technically speaking, it's not. But the motif of stitching and embroidery carries throughout the entire book, and I have to say it's rather satisfying. It's basically a contemporary piece of fantasy, featuring witchcraft and elements of the fairy tale thrown into the mix as well. It is a really well crafted novel, and I personally found it impossible to put down. I read it in a single sitting. I found the plot and the characters to both be as compelling as each other, and I really did find myself being drawn into this reimagined magical version of London. I mean, I love London, and a part of me regrets ever moving from it, but it was a very unfriendly place. Yeah, I find it really hard to resist a bit of fantasy as well. But my imagination just kind of got carried away with this one. There's also a magical library featured, and as a librarian, who can resist a magical library under the British Library? So I think I was really confused to start with as to why this novel was considered general fiction, because there is something that feels really young adult about it. And for the most part, I mean, the story is set in a secondary school following a young witch called Anna, who has just discovered her magic, is navigating friendships, falling in love for the first time, and also discovering family secrets, and at the same time suffering abuse at the hands of her aunt, who has become her parental figure following the death of her parents. An event which in itself, by the way, is shrouded by mystery. She doesn't really know an awful lot about it and what happened. So yeah, it's a novel that really gets to the complexities of being a young woman, a teenager making her way into adulthood. And Anna's story is so authentic that actually, I know it's about witchcraft and things like that, but it's hard not to get thrown back into your adolescent years whenever you're reading the story. It's not a light read by any means, just because it comes across as very young adult. I do find a real darkness in the story as Anna experiences abuse at the hands of her aunt, and a cult like coven who are dictating her every move. Her home where she lives is cold, it's cruel, she is controlled, she is manipulated, and she is hurt as her magic is tried to be controlled. But with the arrival of Effie and Attis, Anna learns about a world in which magic is not supposed to be repressed or suppressed, but is to be accepted as part of who she is. So Effie and Attis take Anna, along with two other students in the school, into their circle of magic. They start to explore, meeting up in the abandoned sewing room of the school no less, to practice their magic. And the first object that features as they explore their magic is an old sewing machine. And I find that quite interesting, you know, that the sewing is related to magic, because for most of us as sewists, it's kind of how it feels a lot of the time. But we explore this magical London filled with libraries, made entirely of books, corridors made of pages, leather volumes that actually listen and tell you what it is you want to know, and even bleed. It's a bit grotesque and gothic in that way. Yeah, it's a place where spells are just all around, and magic can slow down time, and it can draw in the stars so that London actually becomes a really magical place to be. I can't imagine seeing stars in London, to be honest. But there is also this darkness looming over the city of London as well. There are whispers of witches and sacrifices and rituals, heralds of strange and difficult times to come. And Anna must decide whether to fight for her magic or have it bound forever and lose it. It is a really imaginative book, and I was entirely, if you can excuse the pun, spellbound by the protagonist and the prose. Essentially, it's really a coming of age story. Aside from the magic and the witchcraft, Anna's on a road of discovery, transforming herself into a strong young woman from being a nobody, which is what she's called when she's at school, standing up to the bullies who cause her upset, claiming back her free will from her aunt who tries to contain it. And yeah, I thought it was really interesting. Apparently it's also the first in a series, and yeah, I can't wait to read more of this. And even though it's not about sewing or fashion per se, there is something about that alignment with magic and sewing that I just found really interesting. So yeah, that's novel number 3. Novel number 4 is another one that you wouldn't just think of as being about sewing at all, but when you read it you will understand why I've included it. So this book is called Wendy, Darling by A.C. Wise, a reimagining of the Peter Pan story. It's been over 25 years since Wendy and Michael and John returned from Neverland with Peter Pan, and rather than retaining the happy thoughts that we're all familiar with, Wendy is actually the only one with any recollection of what happened in Neverland. Her brothers have forgotten or probably repressed those memories. So Michael has survived World War I, but is suffering from severe depression. John is burdened by economic challenges and family responsibility. Wendy, with her delusions of Neverland, has been diagnosed as mentally ill. She has spent several years in an asylum called St. Bernadette's, and she is only given permission to leave when she agrees to marry a man she's never met called Ned. So forget the Disney story. The core of Wendy's troubles here all start with Peter. She does think of her times with Peter as the best times in her life, but one night Peter returns unchanged, still a boy, and he mistakes Wendy's daughter, Jane, for Wendy and kidnaps her basically and takes her to Neverland. And determined then to find her daughter and bring her home, Wendy recovers the ability to fly, and she goes off to Neverland with the mind of a woman, realizing her childhood experiences were not what she thought they were. What she discovers really is that Neverland is a dark and terrifying place where Peter Pan is basically just a bully, a manipulative, oppressive bully. So the story, I think, is really expertly written. I thoroughly enjoyed it. In spite of changing between Wendy and Jane's points of view, I think it does a really good job of weaving everything together, from Neverland to the asylum and to married life, because we see snippets of Wendy's adult life following her release from the asylum. And I did find it really hard to put down. So it's a novel, as I say, you would never really guess is about sewing, and yet without the story ever explicitly spelling it out, sewing is at the heart of this tale. You'll recall in the original Peter Pan story that when Peter Pan loses his shadow, Wendy sews it back on for him. And this scene is relevant to the plot of Wendy, Darling too. Sewing is a skill that Wendy wields in her adult life. From the clothes she wears, to the friendships she makes, to the mission she faces in finding her daughter, sewing's at the heart of it all. Wendy sews her own clothes, which were a bit unusual for the time. She's sewing wide-legged trousers in which, you know, in her time this would have seemed too manly, too modern, would reflect quite badly on her husband and her father-in-law, who doesn't really like her expressing her own style in any way. And also when she's in the asylum, then Wendy meets Mary, whom she mistakes at the beginning for Tiger Lily. Mary is from the tribe of the First Nations people of Canada and has been displaced into English society and left to be forgotten basically in the asylum. Their friendship is literally stitched together as Mary teaches her how to sew little secret compartments in her clothes and teaches her to improve her sewing skills stitch by stitch. So when Wendy does go off to Neverland to retrieve her daughter, she takes with her 3 things. She takes needles, she takes thread, and she takes her scissors. She has purposefully made her pockets deep enough for them to fit in, and instead of sewing being a cumbersome chore for Wendy, which it might have been for a lot of women in this period, it becomes a feminine power. So yeah, I think one of the things I liked about it was the historicity of the novel. So really it sheds a lot of light on Edwardian society, and the really awful treatment of mental illness in, well, slightly just post-Edwardian England. I think particularly in how it relates to women, it's cruel, it's callous, and it's lazy. I think this as well is my favourite retelling of the Peter Pan story. It's wonderfully dark, it's frighteningly feminist. It is a story that kind of takes on a life of its own, even though it's born out of something that's really familiar to us and to our childhoods. It explores the historical treatment of women, it explores mental illness, but at the same time is exploring really modern issues as well, such as misogyny, mental health, race, childhood, adult trauma, and essentially questions, what do we have to do to survive? Absolutely brilliant, and I loved it, and I really think you should read it. So, how many is that? Is that 4? It's 4 novels. I'll give you one more. It was really hard to choose just one more because I have a list of about 20 of them that are absolutely amazing and fascinating and really you should read, and maybe I'll come back and do a second installment. But the next one I want to share with you is a bit of a tome, just to be warned. I think it's about 600 pages long, and it's Maria Duenas' The Seamstress. So this is a story about espionage, intrigue, adventure, dishonor, love. It's got everything packed in there. It actually was the book that catapulted Maria Duenas to the top of Spanish best-selling list. And it became an adaptation, a television adaptation as well. And apparently it was the most watched premiere at that point that had ever been televised in Spain. So really, really popular. And based on how much I love the book, I really do want to see the TV series as well. I read somewhere at one point that whenever the series was screened, that sewing machine sales in Spain escalated by like 176%. That's a lot. So you can tell how compelling this story actually is. And as I say, it's 600 pages long, so it's not really one of those things you're going to read in one sitting. It's a kind of commitment read, as I like to call them. But I have to be honest, I was so drawn into the story, I think I read it in like 2 or 3 days. It's escapism, for sure, but it's also intellectual escapism. So if you like something that is a little bit more cerebral, this is the book for you. So you get thrown right into the action of the 1930s and 1940s in Madrid and Tangier, and the romance, the descriptions of sensual everyday life in these places just transports you immediately to the center of this story. Many of the characters as well are drawn from real life. So what is really clear here is that Maria Duenas has done her historical research. Her context is spot on. You'll find Alan Hilgarth, a British spy who's working in Madrid. You'll find Juan Luis Biegbetter, the High Commissioner of Spanish Morocco. You'll find Franco's foreign minister and his English lover who turned spy, Rosalind Powell Fox. All these characters are in there giving this novel a serious backbone, making it an even more compelling read than what the story itself might have been had the historical research not been done. So basically, I think one of the things I love about it the most, of course, is that Duenas has decided to make her protagonist a seamstress. That is not without significance. It is not without symbolism. Sewing is a notable signifier of femininity. It is seen to be a sedentary and a passive activity. Traditionally, sewing was something that would have been done by women within their homes, respectable women at that. And Duenas kind of takes this female ideal and turns it on its head, and she makes the heroine's sewing skills the very thing that launches her into a world of intrigue and danger and adventure. Sierra's dressmaking skills and her attention to detail is what gives her the ability to survive, but also to thrive as she plays her part in British intelligence missions in Spain. I think for me, the strength of the novel is in the characterization of the main players, especially Sierra. Her early life and her training perfectly prepares her for her career in sewing, following her mother's path. Her mother was also a seamstress. From the outset of the novel, we meet a young girl who's very dutiful, very willing to do what her mother wants. She's prepared to marry a dependable but a really dull man. And then she meets a stranger who is tall, dark, and handsome, and pretty much sweeps her off her feet, changing the entire trajectory of the novel. And basically, instead of this steady, dependable life, we kind of see her debating. She ends up penniless, pregnant, and abandoned by this tall dark stranger in Algiers, and she basically has to start rebuilding her life from scratch while paying off debts that have been amassed by him. And yeah, she's unable to return to Spain as well. She's trapped because of the Civil War. Essentially, it's a story that is saying what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, I think. That's the bottom line. So she starts rebuilding her life. She sets up a dressmaking studio. She reinvents herself as a really successful and popular couturier. And yeah, I think that's when the tempo of the book really starts to gear up a few notches. And then she embarks on her double life as a spy in the spectre of World War II, which is just looming on the horizon. She is passing information to the British Secret Service, which she gleans from the German Nazi clientele that she has within the safe confines of her shop. The very existence that threatens her life is the thing that you see inspiring her to live it, and she really does thrive from the danger. And I think it's not the kind of novel I would read, I don't think, if it didn't have sewing at the heart of it, because I'm not really into adventure and espionage, generally speaking, but I do really get involved in Sierra's story and I want to follow her every step of the way. And I really don't think it's a surprise that this book was televised. It is epic. Even just in description, the locations are absolutely breathtaking. The costumes, because they're described in perfect detail, are immaculate, and the characters themselves are absolutely mesmerising. I loved it, and I do want to go and watch the show. So there we are, 5 excellent sewing related novels for you to pick up and read and hopefully enjoy as much as I did. Thank you for coming back to my channel. Please do subscribe if you haven't subscribed before, and hit on that notification bell and you'll know when I go and post a new sewing update. Have to be honest, sewing today has been an epic failure. I've been toiling a pattern that was meant to be for a pattern test, and it's not working. So it's graded for a B cup. I need to grade it up to an F cup. And to make the adjustment I need to make, it's distorting the pattern completely out of proportion, and the whole thing needs redrafted. I don't have drafting skills, and while it's just annoying me a lot, it's kind of inspiring me at the same time and making me realize I need to learn how to pattern draft. But not today. Not today. I'm actually going to go and choose something else to toile instead, because the pattern test is not going to happen. It's just not built to accommodate severe curves. So I've got a series of butterick patterns that I'm going to have a look at and choose something to sew. I've got the butterick 6055, which I've seen my dear friend Lisa getting addicted to, so I thought I'm going to pick that up and see what the deal is with these pockets, because she's putting them on everything. And I think it's a really lovely dress. I quite like the colour on there as well, so I'll toile that. I've also got this one, which I've had my eye on for an absolute age, the B6590, and I do want to see if I can get that fitted nicely as well. The other one I have is very, very summery, but I love scoop back necklines, and it's a 60s pattern, the B5748. So those are 3 patterns that I really do want to toile, but I don't know which one to start with. And the other thing I want to make are a couple of nightwear pieces. So I got myself the B6031, and I think I'll make a couple of those. Just need to check if I need any little notions, which I probably do. Yes, I need sliders and stuff like that. So I'll order those, and then I'll be able to get started on that as well. So yes, I'm going to go and toile, or at least trace off a pattern. Hopefully you're getting some sewing time as well. I'm actually off now for a couple of days, so I'll definitely get one of those done. I finished the other pattern test I was talking about on Sunday as well, and it's beautiful. I think I'd still have a couple of adjustments to make if I make it again, but it's beautiful. I really love it. It's a perfect summer picnic dress, and it will be coming to a blog near you soon. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I'm sure I'll catch up with you on Sunday for my Sunday sews. Bye!